Welcome, everyone. I'm here with my friend, Dr. Andrew Schwartz. I'm going to introduce him, and then we'll have a conversation about this really interesting chapter that you guys are reading for the class. So, Andrew Schwartz is an American philosopher and activist. He currently serves as executive director of the Center for Process Studies. He's the co-founder and vice president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, a really important environmental group that I've also been affiliated with at times, and the associate professor of process studies and comparative theology at Claremont School of Theology. His teaching and research cover a wide range of topics, as I think you'll see in our conversation today. That includes environmental philosophy, philosophy of religion, Asian and comparative philosophies, and more. His current work focuses on how big ideas can bring about systems change for the long-term well-being of people on the planet, a concept, in short, that both Andrew and I call ecological civilization. But today we're going to talk about this chapter, as I said, that Andrew wrote with a really influential thinker we're going to talk about in a sec named John Cobb, somebody who's important to both of us, back in 2019. Is that right, Andrew? 2019? Does that sound? I
That
think I
sounds
checked
about
the
right. Yeah,
publication
I think
date.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is on the subject of religious pluralism. That chapter is called All Worship the Same God, and it includes their discussion of a really intriguing possibility that multiple religions could be true. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
It is a pleasure to be here, Dr. Roberts.
Awesome. So I also wanted to say briefly, just so the students know, my relationship with you has, I guess I was realizing we've been probably connected in some way for close to maybe almost 15 years, I think, since Claremont School of Theology. Does that sound about
Probably, yeah.
right?
When you did your degree at Claremont before going
A
to Drew,
master's
right?
there. And I think you
Yeah.
were a PhD student when I was a master's, so we overlapped in different
Students
levels of our
together.
education. But
Yeah.
Andrew ultimately was on my dissertation committee, so I had to defend my dissertation to Dr. Schwartz here, which was an awesome experience. And we also worked at EcoCiv, that environmental group that I talked about earlier. So Andrew's a friend, and I'm really grateful that he's willing to be here with us. So, as I said, I want to talk about John Cobb. When I
Yeah.
first thought about bringing this chapter to my students' attention for this semester for the very first time, I thought, wow, dream big, Austin. What if we brought John Cobb and Andrew onto a call and we had a conversation? And unfortunately, John Cobb just passed away in the last month or so at the age of 99, right?
99.
99.
6 weeks shy of his 100th birthday.
Yeah,
Ah,
just an amazing figure. So I can't pass this opportunity by for you to maybe say something about your co-author, John Cobb, especially since he was a pioneer of the discussion topic that we're going to focus on today with deep pluralism. So I wonder if you mind saying something about who John Cobb was, um, maybe a little bit about his continuing importance in some ways today, and maybe a little bit about your friendship, because I know you two were pretty close over the last several years.
yeah. So John Cobb, if you Google him, you'll just find a race car driver, and that's not him. So it's John B. Cobb Jr. is the one you'd be looking for. Apparently, theologians are less famous than race car drivers, and he, you know, born in the 1920s, 1925, I guess, and he was a World War II vet. He grew up in Japan. His parents were Methodist missionaries. So he had a very interesting upbringing, and eventually did his doctorate at University of Chicago, where he learned about this thing called process philosophy and process theology, which we might talk a little bit about today, which basically became like one of the leading branches of what's called liberal theology, 20th century theology, which basically is a type of theology that incorporates science and reason into theological exploration and understanding. He was a professor at the Claremont School of Theology, Claremont Graduate University, for a number of decades, where he launched, along with one of his former students, David Ray Griffin, they launched the Center for Process Studies in 1973. And I have the privilege of being the executive director of that organization today, some 50 years later. Um, and one of the John had written so many things on so many different topics. It's hard to sort of capture like his thought in a nutshell. Um, but I think for the relevant purposes of this conversation, he is known in a lot of circles for being like a pioneer of Buddhist Christian dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful introduction to one of the great thinkers of the last century or so. I think we both agree with that. So yeah, we do want to talk about his notion of deep pluralism that the two of you introduced, I think, really accessibly near the end of that chapter in particular. But I want to go back to you just before we get into the more theory stuff, the philosophy stuff, and you and I both came from conservative religious backgrounds. You in the Church of the Nazarene, myself in a Pentecostal denomination called the Assemblies of God. So both of us, I don't know about you, but like my church experience until I was like 16 and started going to college and having my mind blown, my awareness of other religions was like they can't possibly be true because I'm in the true religion, and so I wasn't taught to like hate other religious peoples, but I was taught like they're wrong and they need to find Jesus, and there's only one possible true religion. Is that I mean, what kind of experience did you have in your more conservative religious background that might have led you to become a major thinker in theologies of religion and pluralism?
So funny. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the journey, right? And how do we get here? Where were we before? And then like compare and contrast different versions of yourself over the years. And we're like, do I even know that guy? I'm embarrassed of that guy, or I'm proud of that guy, and all those things. But like, I think just like you said, like certainly growing up, like you were taught things, you're told what to believe. And it wasn't so much that I was explicitly taught don't ask questions, but maybe sort of implicitly just taught believe this. It's called faith, and asking questions is called doubt, and doubt's the opposite of faith. So you don't want to ask questions. Of course, questions are like fundamental to philosophy and learning in general. Um, and I think for me, what that often resulted in was just, I mean, if I was being generous to myself, a childlike faith, where I believed the things that I grew up hearing in Sunday school to be absolutely and universally true. And insofar as those conflicted or were at odds with things other people said to be true, I said, well, you're wrong. Obviously, my view is true, and if it wasn't, I wouldn't be believing it. It's like there was a natural like common sense approach to like, well, of course, what I believe is true. Otherwise, like I wouldn't believe that. I believe the other true thing, right? So like the truth is wherever you're sort of standing at the moment, and that's kind of a hard one to escape from. We could talk about that a little later,
Yeah.
but um, but eventually, I found myself bothered, and it didn't happen until college. I think, like you'd said, like it's start studying theology formally outside of a Sunday school type context, and realizing the diversity within Christianity historically. And that struck me as because I was like, wait a second, Christianity itself isn't quite as uniform as I was taught to believe. There's a variety of different expressions of Christianity over the years, people who believe in different things, and even to the point where I didn't even realize the extent to which Catholics and Protestants have different Bibles. I'm like, wait, what? Like, how did that happen? How did this come into being? Where did the Bible come from, anyways? There's these councils. Like, how who decided this canonization process? So that it was the diversity within Christianity that began sort of like raising questions for me. And as I pulled that thread, I started learning more and more about religions outside of Christianity and the diversity there as well, and was really drawn to like the multicultural stuff because these are perspectives I never knew before, right? So I was really like interested in like learning different ways of seeing the world and understanding, the divine. Um, but then I also became a little bit like uncomfortable with the idea that Gandhi's going to hell because he was born into the wrong religion. Um, it's like that didn't feel right. Like he seemed like a good guy. He's doing
Yeah.
good things. Like, uh,
That's a tough pill to swallow there.
right. So the soteriology aspect, right, of salvation and liberation, who gets saved, who doesn't, being born into a religion is sort of an accident, not even a choice, and that somehow that is determining your final resting place after death. Like all of that started feeling less and less like it just made less and less sense to me. So I just kept asking more questions. And the more I pulled that thread, eventually I came across the work of people like John Hick, the people like John Cobb, and then actually found out later that both John Cobb and John Hick were professors in Claremont, California, at the Claremont School of Theology, Claremont Graduate University. I was like, oh, So I ended up making my way there to study. Of course, they had long retired by the time I was doing that, but there was still that sort of legacy of like religious pluralism, which we could talk about
Yeah.
as a way of answering this different truths and different religions question.
Yeah, and I definitely want to do that, talk about those different frameworks, kind of the live options for thinking about religious pluralism, before we really kind of drill down on this notion of deep pluralism that I think people have less awareness of. Um,
Yeah.
but I want to ask you, like, what do you see as like major factors in the world today and just in recent history, however far back you want to go, that have motivated the development of theologies of pluralism, of religious pluralism, and the need to try to like figure out what to do with
Mm,
religious diversity. And I would say, just kind of start out, like I always talk about how globalization is got to be at the top of our list, like,
exactly.
increasing, cultural awareness. We're connected economically more and more, although our economies are starting to become a little bit isolated in our current moment with Trump. But like globalization still integrates the world, and that brings people into different religions into greater contact. But like, do you see other factors that have motivated
Mm.
this explosion of different ways of thinking about religious diversity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, globalization is the first thing that comes to my mind too. I think like other scholars, like Diana Eck from like the Harvard Pluralism Project, I think has written about that as well. Like this simple fact that like increasingly as a result of globalization, you're likely to find yourself being a neighbor to somebody who has a different religion than you. Um, and when you move away from sort of like the mysterious other that we can just sort of like stereotype and put into the corner as faceless and nameless, but just call them the other, um, and then those become your neighbors and friends and the people that you like are on your oh, our kids are in the same baseball team together, or oh, they're in the same choir at school, or like oh, we mow the lawn and wave to each other. And I mean, like, people become real people. And all of a sudden now you
Absolutely.
have to, right. So then you get to know people who are different than you. And then you start saying, okay, well, maybe, maybe I need to figure out how to make sense of, because when let me step back. If your religion's saying that the people who are from different religions are automatically condemned to eternal damnation, and are in some extreme cases, just like lacking the goodness and glory of God. If all things that are good come from God and these people are sort of not in relationship with God, then like, where's their morality come from? Where's their goodness come from? Like that. I mean, there are versions of Christianity that would go as far to say that like, um, yeah, the people from non-Christian traditions like just lack goodness. They lack ethical foundations. But when you start to make relationships with people, a lot of those stereotypes become insufficient, right? So then you have to like re-examine your own perspective and the relationship perspectives of others. So I definitely think proximity of difference makes navigating differences like more urgent.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that emphasis on like the interpersonal side of this, not just like the big macro globalization factor, but the fact that we, my wife and I don't, as my students know, don't see eye to eye on all things spiritual. Like we have different points of view, and yet I love my wife, she loves me. We have a wonderful marriage, and we have so many other things in common, and we magnify the things we have in common, then we have really interesting conversations about the differences, and it's really fun.
Mm.
But that's like easier said than done, right? Like, I mean, part of
Yeah.
it is I was just talking to students before we started this video about this issue, and I was like, partly like the way that works for us is like neither of us are dogmatists, like we both know that we both have to be humble, like in our different points of view, and we're both open to like learning from each other. But like the form of Christianity that I was raised in didn't necessarily like automatically cultivate that kind of anti-dogmatic humility that keeps those conversations open, right? Was that your experience as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the reasons for that is there's this sort of identification of like well, there's a couple of problems. So one is um, thinking that like belief is either like a yes or a no. It's black or white. Like either you're a believer or you're a non-believer. And rather than seeing like degrees of like commitment and belief on like a spectrum or a continuum, um, where like, oh, I might believe this proposition more or less of a greater certainty at any given moment, and that can fluctuate. Um, so then the idea is, okay, so if like belief is like yes or no, right or wrong, in or out, like committed or not committed, and like then identity with a religion is like the same way, like it didn't leave room for sort of nuance. So if you are even saying coming to your beliefs humbly sounds very positive to some ears, to my ears today it does. Um, but I think the younger ears of mine would have said, "Oh, you mean just like you lack conviction, like
Yeah. Yeah.
you're not as committed to your Christian belief. Your faith is clouded by doubt." Um, that that the kind of faith that I was taught to cultivate in many ways was a blind faith. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I often talk times like I think it's a Buddhist metaphor of like there's a way of like holding our beliefs, whether it's about morality or politics or religion, that's like a closed fist where you like
mm,
cling really tightly, and like what do you do like when you got this closed fist? Like, well, you're like in a fighting posture. You're ready to like throw a punch. And I think it was a Buddhist teacher that once taught me in college, like, what if you change the approach, like of open hand, like here's my beliefs, here's the way I live, here's my convictions, and I'm ready for dialogue and for sharing rather than for fighting. But there's another option of just like throwing up your hands and saying like, it all seems so relative. It all seems, so humanly constructed that, why believe any of it at all? How would you respond to that kind of response to all of this? I know it's a really tough question, but I think we might as well talk about it now
yeah,
before we talk about some of these theories.
yeah, and I think that's great. I think that's something that John Cobb was like really concerned with as well, because a lot of people who are interested in like openness to other views, forms of religious pluralism, um, and intolerance, that there's sort of this agnosticism that comes with it. This sort of like relativism where you just say, okay, well, I, everything is true, nothing is true. I don't know what to believe. I'm just giving up on belief. I'm giving up on conviction. So that the only way to embrace the other is to like abandon your own identity. And John Cobb was like, that can't be the solution. He's like, for him, he's like, I'm a Christian. Like, I'm a follower of Jesus and Paul. Like, these are my people. And like, I'm not gonna like sort of lessen my commitments here and become less Christian in order to create space to like embrace Buddhist or Hindus or Jews, right? But he's like, so how then can you navigate a both and where it's not like giving up on your own identity in order to create space for others, but like allowing your own commitments and the commitments of others. So not like, neither nor, but like a both and. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and that is, I think, the essence of the deep pluralist option that I want us to talk about. But I think we should start with like kind of just a quick, well, however long you want to talk about it, like just kind of the live options in theologies of pluralism. Like, I'm realizing that's a echoing a title of John Cobb's live options
yeah,
in Protestant theology from the 60s or something.
yeah.
So what are the live options in thinking about religious pluralism from a religious point of view?
Yeah. As much as I want to answer that, I also keep thinking about the closed fist. And I'm like, all I can think of is Star Wars, where Princess Leia's like telling Vader's like, the tighter you grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers. It's like grasping on sand. And I wonder how
Good.
like religious belief could be like that as well. Like the harder we hold on to our beliefs as dogmatists, the less we actually are able to hold on to. Um,
Yeah.
and recognizing the sort of dynamic fluidity of like religion and belief and the nature of reality and the nature of the
Yeah.
divine, that like holding these things loosely is actually the way to hold on to them more tightly, somewhat
Mm.
paradoxically. Anyways,
Beautifully put. Yeah. You've deepened my metaphor from Buddhism to Star Wars. I appreciate it.
that's where my mind
Very
goes.
good.
Buddhism's good too, though. That's
Yeah.
okay. So the live options, though. So the way I think of it is, and actually this is contested. Like, what are the actual live options? But I will say, like, there's like three main buckets or categories that like classically get used to describe like the kinds of positions with respect to the nature of religious difference and like conflicting truth claims, right? So like the idea is, different religions are saying different things about the nature of ultimate reality, the nature of God, the nature of what it means to be human, the nature of salvation and liberation and life after death. And these aren't things that are supposed to be just, relative to like the believers. Like these are statements about everybody, about all of creation, right? So like God is the creator, not just the creator of the Christians, but like the creator of everything. So the clash of truth claims at the level of universality becomes like a difficult thing to navigate. And there's three basic ways that people have done that. So one is exclusivism, one would be inclusivism, and the other would be pluralism. But as far as exclusivism goes, I think of it in terms of like there's one path up one mountain. So like there's really only one way to get, where you want to go. So only one religion provides salvation is another way to say it. Only one religion provides the ultimate truth. Only one religion provides access to God. All that kind of stuff. And usually what that looks like is my religion is the only true religion, and there's no other religion is true or salvific, yeah, as in can provide a path to salvation. Um, and that actually has been the dominant viewpoint within the history of Christianity. It's there's no salvation outside of the church. It's yeah,
If I can, I just interject. We're at
yeah.
exclusivism, so let me just quickly like what do you know about like other like that's the dominant view within has been the dominant view within Christianity, although not the only one. What about you're just briefly like your knowledge of other religious ways that have they all been just as exclusivist, or have you seen more fluidity in other traditions?
It's a really good question. Of course, we're making sweeping generalizations about very diverse traditions, and that's okay.
Hmm.
We do what we do, but we acknowledge
Yeah,
that, right, in the process. I would
yeah,
say, Islam also like Christianity, tends toward the more exclusive end historically, dominantly at least, popularly. I think, but then you get into India and things shift a little bit. So those monotheistic traditions tend to be more sort of monoalethic, I guess you would say. So like one truth. Um, and so my way is the only way, kind of exclusivism or absolutism is another way of framing it. Um, but then in India, you get like these polytheistic traditions or these like traditions that have more openness to like diversity, multiple gods or multiple ultimates or multiple perspectives on reality. Um, so Hinduism and Jainism are both examples where I think arguably, and again, there could be room for questioning this, but arguably more of an openness to multiple perspectives being valid perspectives. Jainism in
yeah.
particular, I think I've picked up on is like really good at that. They have an entire like one of their like core principles is like the many-sided nature of reality, which is the many-sided nature of truth. And that there is an infinite number of ways of approaching one and the same perspective or one and the same reality in ways that are ultimately true, um,
That's
just in a
fascinating.
limited sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good uh, thing to remind ourselves that there are these, there are different ways. Like you and I are both emerging from more exclusivist tendencies in our younger years within a tradition that has been dominantly exclusivist. But there's also been that second part of one of the live options is inclusivism. And I wonder if you can say something about that because I think. Even in the Christian tradition, if you go back to like Nicholas of Cusa, who's been was a major Christian mystic in the Catholic Church, what are we talking 600 years ago or so, give or take. He was pretty much an inclusivist, I think,
Mm.
and pretty radical for his time, but that's been, I think, maybe a little bit more of a recent tendency in monotheistic faiths, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, inclusivism is an interesting one because I mean, it as the name suggests, right? It's the attempt to widen the exclusive perspective to be more inclusive. But then how, right? How exactly does that work? Like, what does it mean to include things that are different from your own perspective? Um, so, namely, if you said, okay, well, Christianity is true, if Christianity alone is true and everything else is wrong, then you're exclusive. If Christianity is true and other things could be true too, well, is that inclusive or is that pluralistic? How does that work? And it kind of depends. So, one of the popular expressions of inclusivism is actually a 20th century development by a guy named Karl Rahner. Um, and he's a Catholic theologian, attempting to widen the Catholic Church's acceptance of other religions as valid um, pathways toward God. And he came up with this theory of anonymous Christianity. And basically, the idea is um, God is not confined to a single religion, right? So like the divine is all over, it's pervasive throughout the universe. Religions are, insofar as they're human made, they're limited. So religions are inadequate to capture the totality of God. It doesn't mean that they're inadequate for like being vehicles on which we can know God, but there's a sense in which you could say that the God of Christianity is also present in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Judaism, because there's only one God, and that's the God that's offering grace and mercy to all, right? And saying, "Know me," right? And revealing God's self to people. What Ronner ends up doing is saying, okay, well, um, a Buddhist can be saved, just like a Christian can be saved, but a Buddhist isn't saved by anything in Buddhism itself. It's like because the Buddhist is anonymously Christian, or sort of the Buddhist is engaging with God and in Christ on Christian terms, even if they're not aware that they are. Right? So it's kind of this idea that all truth is God's truth. So basically, it's saying there's Christian truths that are present in non-Christian religions, and that makes those non-Christian religions at least somewhat possible at, at providing not as effectively as Christianity itself, but at least in little ways access to God and then eventually salvation. So
It, it's
and, yeah, go ahead.
it sort of seems like, right, like it sounds like a really nice idea until then you like try to put yourself in the shoes of a Buddhist or a
Right.
Hindu who are like, oh, so you're telling me that even though I think I'm aiming for nirvana, beneath that is the real truth of I'm actually sort of kind of approximating worshiping the God of Jesus Christ. So I'm actually quite mistaken, but if as long as I'm a good person, Jesus will have, there'll be grace through Christ for me. Is that kind of a fair way
I
of
think that's
thinking
I
about it?
think that is the issue, right? So um it in at least in Ronner's case, his anonymous Christian perspective, it privileges Christianity as the full religion, the best religion, and then basically includes inclusivism. It includes other religions under Christianity, insofar as there's Christian elements of truth within those religions. Right. So insofar as it's the Christian God and the Christian Christ that's present in these, presenting to these religions, even if they're unaware of it. And so then what it does is says, uh, okay, so the Buddhist is secretly Christian, even though they didn't want to be and they don't know that they are. So, like, Christianity is sort of subsuming other religions, eliminating the differences, and saying, insofar as your religion has something valuable to offer, it's because it's basically reflects the same truths that are present in my religion. So you think, okay, so how would a Buddhist respond? Well, they might say, well, how come you're not an anonymous Buddhist? How come I have to be an anonymous you and you can't be an anonymous me, right? Like, why not privilege the Christian truth? But it treats difference in a way that doesn't actually embrace it in its difference. It says, insofar as you're different from me, I basically still reject you. But insofar as you're the same as me, I can accept you because I'm only really accepting myself within you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of
Yeah, it does. It does. I think it's a really important critique for us and the students to consider there. And there might be some in the class who are, more inclined to shift from, an exclusivist to an inclusivist view because it does feel more generous. It is more generous and
it's
compelling.
definitely more generous.
And I
Yeah.
think as long as you have that kind of intellectual humility about your own faith, like it can open avenues of greater social harmony and peace and build relationships with people who are different. But it does still feel condescending, I think, which is actually the critique that Stephen Prothero makes in God Is Not One, the book that students who are watching this have been reading this semester. So there's a major thinker you mentioned earlier, and that's John Hick. And I think of him as the pioneer of theologies of pluralism. I think he's the most well-known one. In fact, I'm going to include a video for the students of John Hick, like a 10-minute
Nice.
thing of him talking so they can kind of hear it from him. But like, maybe you can just briefly say like what his approach to pluralism is, and then tell us why he's wrong.
Hick, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, John Hick is he's one of those kinds of figures that shaped an academic discussion for decades, such that you can't really do religious, in a conversation on theologies of religions or religious pluralism without mentioning him, because his work, he's just been so central to the discussion that basically either people were responding to him, or well, I mean that was most of what was happening. I feel like it was like Hick put out some ideas, and people like then there's like 20 years of people just responding to Hick, and why he was right or wrong or whatever. Mostly people were saying he's wrong. But so what does he say? So basically, he's like, God has many names, uh, and that all the different religions are more or less equally valid and true, paths and ways. So there are many paths up the one mountain. But so how does that work? So basically, he makes this. He picks up on this philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and this sort of idea that there's a distinction between the way things really are, so like with reality in itself, and then sort of the way that we know reality or the way we perceive reality. So basically, perception and reality. So one of the great analogies that Hick borrows from India, Jainism and Hinduism, is the blind man and the elephant, right? So it's basically this idea that you got a bunch of people, they're blindfolded or blind or whatever. You got somebody telling them, oh, they're all touching different parts of the elephant, and then they're coming up to the conclusion that the elephant is like whatever it is that they're touching or experiencing. You hold on to a leg, oh, an elephant's like a tree. Somebody else is like, no, you moron, an elephant's like a snake, and they're holding on to the trunk. Oh no, an elephant's like a rope, and a fan, they're holding on to the ear, right? So you touch different parts of the elephant, you come to different conclusions about what the elephant's like. And John Hick's like, that's exactly what God is like. Although technically he uses the language the real to replace God because he thought God had too much baggage of what was understood by that as personal or impersonal and all that kind of stuff. So basically, it says, okay, different religions are have a sense. We're in a sense epistemic blindness. Like we don't really know ultimate reality in its pure unperceived sense. We only know as perceived, as we perceive, right? We only know as knowers, and we always perceive from a limited perspective. So that perspective means, it allows us to have different interpretations of God that are not the same, but also con- not contradictory. So they're complementary interpretations. So exactly how does that work? Well, he uses another analogy. There's like this like ambiguous kinds of figures. So like you might see like a duck or a rabbit. Is it an old woman or a young woman? Like those kinds of paintings that are like little illusions, right? Where you look at it and there's more than one way of interpreting it, and neither way is exclusively right. Both ways are right. It just depends on how you look at it. And Hick also says, well, God's like that too. There's an ineffability, an unknowability about the nature of the divine, and that allows for multiple interpretations to be right, even though they're different. But our perspectives are always limited. So just
Yeah.
acknowledging that allows space for us to all be, I guess, like you said, humble about the incompleteness of our interpretations of ultimate reality.
Yeah. And I think maybe even the way that you frame an alternative approach to pluralism, I mean, there's still important lessons to be learned there, and there's still value in what Hicks says. But you and John have proposed, and in a way, you take a more philosophical, theologically sophisticated analysis of this problem, where Stephen Prothero in the book God Is Not One says, actually, like, there's not one mountain. John Hicks wrong. All these thinkers who say there's one mountain or one elephant, and all the religions are, partially grasping some aspect of it. Prothero wants to be like, no, like if we really pay attention to the differences, they all have different problems that they're trying to solve, and different solutions and different techniques and exemplars. So that like he wants to magnify difference in a way. But there may be actually a problem like going so far to just magnifying difference without providing some sort of interpretive framework for that difference
Mm.
can kind of leave, I think, a lot of people unsatisfied. because we seek coherence in our thinking. We want, like, I think the human mind, in a way, if I can be so bold, like reason is itself something that wants to tie things together, right? It's intrinsically wired that way. And so, like, I think what I read you and Cobb is doing in this chapter, and Cobb, throughout his career, is trying to figure out, like, hey, maybe there's multiple mountains rather than just one mountain. How? So this is the
Right.
framework of deep pluralism, and like this is a complicated theory. I think if you get into the metaphysics of it, it gets really wild. And I
It
will
does.
actually try to do some stuff in lectures with the students on this. But I wondered if you can say, like, how does this framework improve on Hick or correct Hick, however you want to frame that? Like,
Yeah.
just kind of situate it as a kind of response to Hick, and giving a new way of thinking about pluralism that might be more realistic.
Yeah, I think so. The critique that people like John Cobb, David Griffin, or myself have leveled against Hick is that basically so if you think deep pluralism is an alternative to Hick, it's like, does that make his shallow pluralism? And it's like the argument is like, well, sort of. It's because Hick is assuming that underneath the diversity, there's actually an ultimate unity. All religions are oriented toward the same ultimate reality, trying to achieve the same ultimate religious ends, trying to accomplish the same, final resting place. Like they all have the same goal, and they're all oriented toward the same thing. Um, and that's just a huge assumption. But what grounds that assumption? Like, why assume that we're all touching the same elephant? Why aren't there multiple elephants? There's a wonderful cartoon I found that's like a bunch of people touching an elephant and another guy touching like a guy chained to a rock, and it's like they're describing different things. Um, why not assume that the different religions are actually describing different ultimate realities rather than giving different names to the same reality? Why assume that all the different religions are trying to accomplish the same ultimate goal, rather than just different names of it, rather than saying they're actually trying to accomplish different things? So the deep pluralists come in and say, like Prothero, I think that maybe we should be slow to assume underlying unity and sort of shallow diversity, and actually flip it around and say, maybe difference. We need to create space for there to actually be genuine differences, um, and that maybe there are different mountains, like you said. Maybe there's different goals, different ultimate realities at play. So then the challenge becomes, how can we describe the cosmos, the world, ultimate reality in a way that allows different religions to be talking about different ultimate realities and different ultimate goals, um, and yet still have a coherent worldview? So this is the complicated part, right? So John Cobb does this through tapping into the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, mathematician turned philosopher, early 20th century. And basically his view is, maybe there's different ways of describing ultimacy, in a way that are complementary rather than contradictory. So maybe there's one sense in which there is a personal supreme being, the sort of the ultimate being, and we might call that God. And then you could say, okay, well, there's some religions that are actually oriented toward that kind of ultimate, the kind that has characteristics like love and compassion and mercy and justice, and like you can relate and be in a relationship to that kind of ultimate reality. Um, but then there's another way that you see different religions describing ultimate reality as more impersonal, not a supreme being, but more of a ground of being, or being itself. It doesn't have the same kinds of personal characteristics. It's more of like a force, a sort of a principle. Um, and so there you get religions that are talking about ultimate reality in that way. And in Cobb's process framework, he says, well, that's what Whitehead means by creativity. So you have creativity as an ultimate, God as an ultimate. But even apart from that jargon, you say there's one way of talking about ultimacy that's a ground of being, one way of talking about ultimacy that's a supreme being, and then there's another way of talking about ultimate reality that's basically the totality of finite things. It's the world, the cosmos. Like the cosmos is itself ultimate. When you take all physical reality from all history and put it together, like that's another way of describing ultimate reality. And then of course there's indigenous religions and others that like are oriented more toward that kind of way of speaking about ultimacy. So what Cobb does is basically says, so if you have this metaphysical cosmological structure that allows for at least three different ways of talking about ultimacy, that are actually intertwined and not competing. And then you can observe that different religions at different times are oriented toward, they might be speaking about or like directing their worship toward any one of these different kinds of ultimate realities. You could then conclude that different religions can be oriented towards something that's truly ultimate in the nature of things and yet be oriented towards something that's different. So that allows for difference and non-conflicting truth to both make sense. So that's where he gets his pluralism from.
So in dialogue, say, between a Christian and a Buddhist, um, there's going to be an assumption that one can find common ground, say on ethics, or maybe even contemplative prayer as a kind of similarity to Buddhist meditation practices. But there's not going to be that assumption that the Buddhist is secretly worshiping Jesus in their meditation that they don't even realize they're doing, like Ronner sort of seems to imply with his
Right.
inclusivism. There's going to be an acceptance that the Buddhist is pursuing their own distinct path in a world where reality is multifaceted and
Mm-hmm.
that it's complex enough to hold together a diversity of pursuits of human flourishing or human wholeness. Is that a helpful way to put that?
I remember John Cobb saying something like, um, maybe Buddhism is going to be better than Christianity as a path toward nirvana. And Christianity is going to be better than Buddhism as a path toward Jesus. And like
Interesting.
both are trying to do different things, and that makes both of them valid and useful and meaningful and true. Um, so you need both to accomplish different ends. So really, then that even actually opens up the door for multiple belonging and being a Buddhist Christian or something like that, where people affiliate with more than one tradition. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I actually, I'm looking at the time and we're about out of time here, and I do want to kind of end on that question of multiple religious belonging, because I think it's important, and I think that if one were to be a deep pluralist, it's a natural kind of way for some people in that framework to go. Um, what are the challenges of like what are the kind of critiques, maybe just like one or two critiques that you think are particularly compelling? Maybe
Hmm.
they can be answered, but like of deep pluralism. Because in some sense, like we've just sort of set it up like, well, there's exclusivism, and that's obviously
Yeah.
wrong. The
Yeah.
dogmatism,
This is wrong.
dogma,
That's wrong. That's wrong. This is the truth.
here's the one. Yeah, so
Yeah.
like I mean I think in an effort to kind of be aware of like the possible limitations of any framework, like what do you see as like maybe some areas of critique that need to be taken seriously for the deep pluralist approach?
Yeah, the ones that come to mind immediately. One is, do you have to embrace Whiteheadian metaphysics to make sense of deep religious pluralism? And if so, doesn't that just make it, like, well, basically, does it make it another form of exclusivism? The Whiteheadian worldview is the right worldview, and everything else is wrong. The only way to understand. So this kind of the same critique that people make against Hick is that in order to describe the situation of the different religions as blind men and the elephant, it assumes that there's somebody standing outside that actually sees the situation as it really is, rather than being another blind person alongside all the other blind people. Um, and you could argue that Cobb and others like are making the same mistake. We're describing the ultimate nature of reality in a way that nobody else could possibly do. Everybody else is giving incomplete visions of reality, and we're giving the full vision of reality. It's like that's a problem. The other is Alvin Plantinga's sort of critique of all pluralist is basically saying you're basically just exclusivist. Um, you just aren't admitting it. Like, which is to say, every truth claim um, assumes a rejection of its opposites. So he's basically following the law of non-contradiction and things like that. And I think the argument there would be if it's a claim about the nature of reality, does it inherently exclude non-deep religious pluralist claims about the nature of reality?
Yeah, and
But
and of course, like the way that a process theologian like you and John Cobb, like the personal God ultimate is of course excluding the Calvinist version of that God, um,
Right, right.
within the framework. So there's even within theistic religions that are focusing on the God ultimate rather than the impersonal or the transpersonal ultimate of Brahman and Hinduism and the cosmic ultimate of some indigenous traditions or whatever. Um, there's already going to be internal differences, like you mentioned that earlier.
Actually, another deep pluralist from a Hindu perspective, Jeffrey Long, makes a very compelling argument along those lines where he names the limitations of this Cobb version of pluralism um, by saying even if it's successful at explaining away the differences between different religions, it can't explain away all the differences between religions. So even like internal. So you might say, okay, well, this religion's oriented toward, the personal supreme being. This one's oriented toward the cosmos. This one's oriented toward the ground of being. What about differences between both traditions that are oriented toward the same kind of ultimate reality? But I think John Cobb would then say, so what? Um, because at the end of the day, John Cobb, and I learned this, and maybe it's because he and I had different backgrounds, he didn't care so much about the truth side of things. He was definitely more of a pragmatist. It's about what works. Religion should be useful and effective.
Yeah,
So it's all
yeah.
about how useful is religion to achieve a particular desired end. And then the other truth stuff, he's like, yeah, whatever. Let's leave it off to the side.
Yeah, but and I think on that note, the pluralistic approach for Cobb and for yourself, I imagine, is more conducive to social flourishing, personal flourishing, harmony, because it opens up the possibility of deeper and wider relationships with people across difference. Whereas the more traditional form, like if everybody's an exclusivist, there's exclusivists and there's exclusivists, the kind that says like there is really just one way and that's it. There's a kind of there's a history of baggage, I think, with that kind of exclusivism of, in some cases resulting in violence, between
Yeah.
exclusivist claims in religion that we really want to get away from, whatever people think about these different models. Well, let me end on this point about multiple religious belonging. And there's a million other questions I could ask you about this because it's fun. Um, but I think, just briefly, I think deep pluralism and, even Hick's identist pluralism both create possibilities for multiple religious belonging or hybrid religious identities. And I think John
Mm.
called himself a Buddhized Christian rather than a Buddhist Christian. There's a growing number of those. Prothero in the book mentions Jew-boos as a category
Yep.
that Jewish Buddhists have given themselves. And I had a professor, Hyodong Lee, who was on my dissertation committee. Remember him?
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, he's got like, yeah, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity all kind of swirling in his own framework, as a Neo-Confucian Christian theologian. Like, I don't know if this is an area that you personally feel drawn towards, but what do you see as like the risks and the possibilities for multiple religious belonging today, and how that might lead us in a
Mhm.
more positive direction in the kind of like really, really divided, fractured world? Do you think it's like a positive trend, or do you think
Mm.
it's something that we need to be careful with?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's probably always a little bit of both in that. Um, I think that multiple religious belonging, the risks that I see in it could be, one is it conceptually coherent? So like, does it make sense to be a Christian Muslim that says Jesus is both divine and not divine, right? Like embracing the core of Christianity and the core of Islam at the same time. Is that possible? Um, if not, like, which one do you lean toward? Like, how do you navigate that space? Um, I think the idea that you said, you get Jewish Buddhist and Christian Buddhist, you see that a lot more common than you do like Christian Muslims. But the benefits, though, I think outweigh the risks, which could be um, the kinds of incompatibilities we might find in theory aren't as relevant in practice. So you can be a part of a worship community, a faith community. Um, you can belong to multiple faith communities without really any inherent conflict because it's people coming together around some sort of core values. It's less about the sort of the metaphysics of it all, and the sort of focus on ultimate truth, and more about How should we live? How should we treat one another with kindness and compassion, and love and mercy? And I think um, the people that I know that participate in multiple communities, and even sometimes multiple Christian communities, so they might go to more than one denomination of Christianity, but especially those who go to multiple uh, different faith gatherings. There's different things that they're getting from different communities, if that makes sense. Which gets back to that sort
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
um, what what is religion doing for you? What function does it serve? And is it useful? And maybe it's more useful to have more than one.
Yeah. And I think, that sense of like, what is religion doing for you? You and I both care a lot about, you know, like religion has to matter today in part because we're facing, civilizational challenges of an unprecedented scale. And I'd like to believe that like deep pluralism, this framework that you and Cobb have developed together in this chapter and proposed, and, you've really helpfully explained today, could potentially play a role in, creating the conditions that are more maybe conducive to building an ecological civilization. Would you say that that's a kind of a key motive for you still today?
I would love that. I think I did like this kind of work in my dissertation years ago, and then quickly saw that the same kind of thinking that can navigate disagreements among religions could also be applied to navigating disagreements in society, in politics, in relationships. Like just disagreements are part of life because
Mm.
difference is a part of life, and how do we navigate difference is like really key to how do we learn to live together, which is like the heart of democracy, right?
Yeah.
So I would
Yeah.
love for these more um, tolerant, open, inclusive, pluralistic kinds of ways of thinking about difference and otherness um, that broke down some of those us versus them barriers that often lead toward violence against people who are different, exclusion against people who are different, and instead turn that around and find ways to build community, diverse communities. I have a friend who says, um, he's like, a garden of a single flower is just not a very good garden. You want lots of diversity in your garden so that it will flourish. And I think societies are the same way. So
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to end. Well, I think this is a really powerful vision and set of possibilities, and I hope the students, appreciate the learning about this perspective from somebody who's, at the cutting edge of thinking about how to build a more, a better world that's more pluralistic and inclusive and more tolerant, and hopefully, leading us in a better direction. So, thank you so much for sharing your
thank
wisdom.
you.
Thanks for writing an awesome chapter
Pleasure.
with Dr. Cobb. I'm sure the students valued this conversation very much. I know I have. So it was good to see you.
Likewise.
Let's talk more often, okay?
Definitely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.